Well, thank you very much. By now, I think you've probably realized that this isn't going to be quite like Trump flying into Midland. No swagger, no surprises, and you don't have to follow my Twitter feed for the next 2 weeks. But I'm very thankful for being here. I flew in yesterday, kind of a quick in and out trip this time to Austin. It's great to be back in Austin. And as I was walking out through the terminal, I was just shocked to find Joe Biden. Did you know Joe Biden was here in Austin? And I had a chance to come up and greet him. And he said to me, "Thanks, Governor. Great to be back in Louisiana." So kind of gave me a promotion. I figure kind of equal opportunity political commentary today. But I'm very grateful to be here. I could have come in by Zoom. I didn't want to do that. Thank you for coming for the Leadership Circle Luncheon today. It's, I think, a very important event to support a very important organization here in Texas. And I'm very grateful to be invited by Joe and the Alliance team to be with you today. Movements rise and fall on the backs of strong organizations. And strong organizations drive movements. And we have to have strong organizations like Texas Alliance for Life to keep the pro-life movement effective here in Texas. One of the strengths of the pro-life movement in the United States is federalism. We have a federalist system. We don't have a parliamentary system like Canada or Great Britain. And if you look at countries with parliamentary systems, with just one national legislature, you find pro-life movements that tend to be rather weak, if not moribund. And one of the strengths of the pro-life movement since Roe versus Wade has been federalism. The fact that if we're blocked in Congress, we can work in the states. And most of the progress of the pro-life movement in the United States is due to the states. And certainly Texas has been a key to that progress over the last decades. And Texas Alliance for Life for 30 years has been so important to that progress. And I admire Joe and his leadership and his experience, which leads to expertise. And expertise means knowing how to get things done and what's important and how to get important things done. So I'm honored to be invited to be here with you today. And I'm so glad that I didn't have to come in by Zoom. I was offered to come in by Zoom, but Zoom has been great over the last 4 or 5 months in certain opportunities, certain venues. But there are real problems with it. I've had a lot of Zoom calls over the last 4 months, and people munching, potato chips, and dogs and cats and frogs jumping across the screen. And I was in one call with about 8 or 12 people. It was the closest I ever come to being on the Brady Bunch. And behind one screen, there was this shirtless guy that was walking back and forth. So none of that today. Instead, today, I want to just talk with you about 3 points. And then I want to open it up to questions and answers. First, you've made tremendous progress here in Texas, and we have across the nation, through a prudential strategy. And I want to explain that today. Secondly, the Louisiana case that Joe mentioned in the June medical decision did not settle Roe versus Wade or Casey. In fact, it left them unsettled as ever. And that's good, and I'll explain why. And the third is that we have 88 days until the election, and we all need to do whatever we can do in terms of time and resources to achieve pro-life victories. Progress in a movement is made up of taking advantage of opportunities and circumventing obstacles that are in our way. And the pandemic of 2020, despite all the suffering in the United States and across the world, has here in the United States provided opportunities to talk about the sanctity of human life and to raise public dialogue about the sanctity of human life. I mean, certainly one of the most significant themes of the pandemic in the United States, if not around the world, has been the focus on the sanctity of human life. I mean, Americans have debated physical health and mental health and economic health, but the focus has been on human life at the center of this pandemic. And that has allowed us to talk about the sanctity of human life. And the death of George Floyd and the public dialogue about why that happened and what to do about it has opened the door for us to remind our fellow Americans about the Declaration of Independence and how we are all created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And that equal creation and that endowment by our Creator is at the foundation of individual dignity, respect for individuals, and the sanctity of human life. And that has all been to the good for public dialogue in this country. And I am happy to say today that expectations about abortion and Roe versus Wade are changing. They have been changing ever since the 2016 election. At a debate at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia last fall, which featured AUL President Catherine Foster, two pro-abortion rights advocates, Catherine Colbert and Mary Ziegler, declared that this court will overturn Roe versus Wade. So expectations are changing. And we see it in the actions of the red states and the blue states in the state legislative sessions in 2019. So we have made progress and momentum through a prudential strategy. We've seen tremendous progress in state legislation across the country. And state legislation is important because it is democratic action. It's democratic debate and democratic action leading to the incorporation of moral principle and moral convictions into democratically approved laws. And that is incredibly important for our civil society and seeing that the sanctity of human life is protected state by state, year by year, in the law, approved by democratic majorities and the democratic process and the constitutional system we have. In addition, we've seen pro-life representation, especially in the Republican Party, improve over the years. Now, since I started with AUL 35 years ago, we have worked with pro-life Democrats and pro-life Republicans, and certainly a bipartisan foundation for the sanctity of human life is important. And we obviously hope that every political party in this country is pro-life or will become pro-life. But if you just look at the pro-life representation, for example, in the Republican caucus in the U.S. House, the last pro-abortion member of the Republican caucus in the U.S. House left 2 years ago. And that pro-life representation has grown considerably since the 70s and 80s. Or look at the growth in the number of states with pro-life working majorities, meaning a pro-life majority in the House and Senate in a particular state. Back in the 70s and 80s, there were about 8 states with that. Today, there are 25 to 30 states with working pro-life majorities in the House and the Senate in the particular state. Or look at the drop in the abortion rate. It's dropped somewhere between 50-55% since 1990. And if you look at the statistical analysis of Michael New, he attributes much of that drop to pro-life legislation. There are other causes, but he attributes much of it to the pro-life legislation that's been passed across the states. And those gains are reflected here in what you've accomplished here in Texas over the last 30 to 40 years. Besides preserving an enforceable abortion prohibition, there are many, many examples I can give you, and I don't have time to go into all of them. You can talk with Joe or Matthew and see the incredible list they've come up with. But I would emphasize several that I think are really emblematic of pro-life progress. You have a fetal homicide law from conception, meaning that the killing of an unborn child outside the context of abortion, in like all other areas of Texas society, the killing of the child is treated as a homicide from conception. You're one of 30 states with a fetal homicide law from conception. 3/4 of the states in this country have a fetal homicide law from conception, and virtually all of those have been enacted since Roe versus Wade. You have a prenatal injury law from conception. You've passed a 20-week limit on abortion. You're one of 20 or 21 states with a 20-week limit, which I think is a direct rebuke to the Supreme Court's viability rule. And you have ultrasound as part of your informed consent law. And I could go on and on. But these are building blocks. You know, in the real world, in the concrete world we live in with obstacles and restraints, we can't achieve perfection. And we can't achieve even the ideal without overcoming obstacles. And we can't achieve it immediately in the blink of an eye because of the obstacles that exist. So we need building blocks. We need a broader foundation. And each of these laws creates those building blocks so that you can really say you have a culture of life in Texas. And that's not just reflected in our opinion, my opinion, it's reflected in the democratically accepted laws that you have made. And that progress has come through the cardinal virtue of prudence. You know, we're all incrementalists in a certain sense, in the sense that we all follow certain steps to achieve financial progress, progress in our career, progress in our households, progress in our families. We all follow certain steps. There were steps followed to organize this. You took certain steps to get here today. In that sense, we're all incrementalists. But prudence is practical wisdom oriented toward the moral good or moral purpose in politics. And prudence has to guide our steps. What are the right steps? What are effective steps? What steps will lead us to our goal? So prudence has to direct those steps. And the writings of Thomas Aquinas, the work of William Wilberforce against the slave trade in England, the work of Abraham Lincoln here in the 1850s against slavery, they provide an American tradition that is critical to guide our political work. And most simply, as I said kind of at the outset, prudence is about identifying opportunities to make progress in the legislature, in the courts, in politics, and having a realistic understanding of obstacles and not ignoring them, but succeeding despite them, circumventing them, surmounting them. Obstacles in the courts, obstacles in the legislature, the billionaires and the billion-dollar foundations that are funding abortion, Planned Parenthood, and its nefarious work. All of these are obstacles, and we can't ignore them. We have to defeat them. And yet, incremental gains, day by day, month by month, are always good. We need to create political victories, and the series of political victories creates momentum, and momentum builds on itself in leading us to our goals. So your work in Texas, like the work in other states around the country, has kept Roe versus Wade unsettled. It has challenged the court, it has challenged the court's abortion doctrine, and it has left Roe versus Wade unsettled. It has also reduced abortion and the abortion rate. And it has created affirmative legal protection for the unborn child that didn't exist back in 1973. So my second point today is that June Medical did not settle Roe versus Wade or Planned Parenthood versus Casey. It left them unsettled, and that's hugely important. The outcome in June Medical was, in fact, misreported by the media. It was incompletely reported by the media, and the media just reported the result. I mean, I've got here the Wall Street Journal article, front page of Tuesday, June 30. It simply says, Supreme Court strikes down abortion curb. And yes, Chief Justice Roberts voted with 4 pro-abortion justices to strike down the Louisiana law. But the fact of the matter is that I would characterize June Medical as 1 step back and 2 steps forward. And here's why. Chief Justice Roberts voted to strike down the Louisiana law, but he didn't join the reasoning and the rationale. He wrote his own opinion, and his own opinion hasn't been reported. His own opinion, I characterize it as a head fake. He said, on one hand, because this law and the facts in Louisiana are the same as they were in the Texas case in 2016, I have to strike this down. I disagree with that. I think it was wrong, but that's what he said. But then he turns and says, I'm not going to apply that precedent after today. I'm going to go back and apply a more lenient, a more favorable, a more deferential review of state pro-life legislation of all kinds. And by that opinion, he basically agreed to join the 4 dissenters, which were Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh. And in fact, Justice Kavanaugh pointed out very frankly in his dissent that 5 of the justices disagreed with the more harsher standards applicable to abortion legislation, which are no more. And that June medical opinion by Justice Breyer is basically dead. So basically what June medical did say is that we have a new majority on the court. We have a new majority of 5 justices, perhaps for the first time in 30 years, that are going to be more favorable, more deferential, more lenient toward state abortion laws. And we've also already seen the impact of those 5 votes. You probably didn't hear that within 3 or 4 days, that new majority invalidated or struck down 2 pro-abortion decisions that had been pending at the court from involving pro-life laws from Indiana. And basically the new majority said, you got it wrong. Go back and reconsider what you did in light of what we have to say today. So that provides some promise that those 2 bad decisions in the lower courts are going to be corrected. We've also seen the impact of June medical in a case called ACOG versus FDA, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists versus the Food and Drug Administration. This is a case in which the pro-abortion American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists is trying to invalidate the FDA's limits on chemical abortion. And we've seen the FDA's attorneys go into court and go in swinging to exclude the ACOG and its pro-abortion representation, and also to say that the courts have to apply this new, more lenient, more deferential standard to the FDA's limits. And I was glad to see that Texas, and your good Attorney General here, joined in an argument and a brief supporting the FDA's limits on chemical abortion. And then on July 29th, we've seen, again, the impact of this new majority in a Louisiana case. There was another case in Louisiana involving a challenge to virtually all the regulations and licensing schemes of abortion clinics in the state of Louisiana. And that case was dismissed because of the new majority on the Supreme Court. So what's going to happen in the other 60 abortion cases that are in the pipeline now? That's correct, 60 abortion cases in the pipeline. We have obstacles and limitations, but one obstacle and limitation is certainly that not that we lack additional abortion cases in the pipeline that will come back to the Supreme Court later this year and in 2021 and 2022. So there will be a number of opportunities to present our arguments to the court as to why and how it should overturn Roe versus Wade. And 3 of those 60 cases are pending at the court right now and will be considered probably when the new court session opens up in the first Monday, the first week of October. One of the cases is called the Baker case from South Carolina, in which South Carolina is attempting to defund Planned Parenthood and exclude Planned Parenthood from its federal Medicaid dollars, federal Medicaid program. And that affects 12 states, 12 other states that are trying to defund Planned Parenthood and exclude Planned Parenthood from the state's federal Medicaid dollars. The second case is from Alabama called the Dobbs case, which involves a 15-week limit on abortion that Alabama has passed. And the third case involves the Trump administration's Protect Life rule in Title X, which attempts to segregate abortion clinics and abortion dollars and abortionists from the Title X program. So all 3 of those cases are pending. The court could take all of those or none of those. But behind those cases are the other 57 cases which are in the pipeline from across the country. And so we will have a number of opportunities to press the case against Roe versus Wade in 2021, 2022, and so forth. What to do about Chief Justice Roberts? Are you uncertain about Roberts and what he's going to do in these future cases? Are you uncertain about what he might do about Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey? Well, at the end of the Supreme Court's term at the end of June, the Wall Street Journal described Roberts as, quote, embracing the role of institutionalist as he sought to keep the court above the nation's intense partisanship during a time of national upheaval, unquote. Well, if that's all true, let's assume that's all true for the moment, there are at least 3 steps we can be taking and that we are taking with regard to the court. And the first is we simply need to persuade Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito and Kavanaugh and Gorsuch that Roe versus Wade has to go. I mean, that's our opportunity in these other cases. The lawyers before the court, the state attorney generals, the legislators as they pass legislation, and the lawyers just need to keep pressing the case to help the other justices agree with Justice Thomas, who issued a strong dissent in the June medical case, that Roe and Casey simply have to go entirely. Justice Alito and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh have not yet joined that position, but it's our burden and our challenge to persuade them that they have to go, that Roe and Casey have to go. Secondly, as Joe alluded to, we simply have to change the membership of the court. I mean, we want the largest possible majority on the court to overturn Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. A 5-4 overruling is inherently unstable. I mean, a president could come in 2020, 2024, 2028, and change one of those justices, or substitute one of them with a retirement, and the 5-4 overturning could be overturned 5-4. So we want a 6-3 majority or a 7-2 majority or an 8-1 majority to overturn Roe versus Wade because it will be more stable and more permanent and more long-lasting. I mean, if we overturn Roe versus Wade 5-4, you know Planned Parenthood's not going to give up. They're going to try to overturn it themselves. And so we need the strongest possible majority, and that means continuing to work to change the membership of the court. And that means pro-life political victories. Pro-life political victories from, the top of the national ticket to the local state ticket, that's important. It's important because the presidency is important and the U.S. Senate is important, but it's also, of course, important for state offices across Texas. And pro-life political victories can only send a positive message to the court that the country will support the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So we need pro-life political victories, the broadest and deepest we can possibly achieve. And that leads me to my third point, which is that the upcoming 2020 general election is going to be critical for pro-life voters to turn out and to be working for the next 88 days and doing all that we can do with our finances and our time to help achieve pro-life victories. Now, I'm not here today to endorse any particular candidate. I'll leave that to Joe and the Alliance. But I would offer 5 thoughts, if not for you who are politically astute and politically involved, maybe to talk about with your family and friends who are maybe uncertain at this particular point. But the first is that we can't sit on the sidelines. We all have to be involved because elections are a unique opportunity for citizens of this country to be involved in democratically accountable public officials and holding public officials accountable. And our goal in elections has to be the common good and voting for public officials who will achieve the common good and work for the common good. Secondly, we have limited choices. In primary elections, you may have 15 to 16 candidates, and maybe one or more of those candidates, really reflects your political convictions. But, because of our constitutional system and our electoral system, when you get to the general election, you're pretty much, winnowed down to 2 candidates reflecting the 2 major political parties. And those limited choices aren't by our design. They are imposed upon us. And our job in that situation is to be involved in those elections, to vote for the candidate who will promote the greatest good or will lead to the least harm in promoting the common good. That's our job. And third, voting for less than the ideal candidate in those circumstances is not a compromise. A compromise is a mutual concession to reach an agreement. That's really what a compromise is. And voting for the better of two candidates with limited choices is not a compromise under any meaning of the word. We didn't choose those two candidates, maybe, but that's our choice. And our obligation is to vote for the candidate who will promote the the best, or the least harm. Fourth, we need to compare the character and the policies of those two major candidates. Not just character, not just policies, but it's both, because the combination of both will mean what the impact of that candidate will mean if they achieve elected office. Their tenure, their impact will be a combination of character and policies. And so we have to carefully and thoughtfully compare character and policies. And my fifth point is, don't be distracted by third-party candidates who can't win. I mean, if you look across elections since the beginning of the 20th century, no third-party candidate has come close to winning a presidential election, precisely because they're not backed by the organization of major parties. I mean, look at you know it better than anybody else in the country being here in Texas, that the best third-party candidate, or the third-party candidate who made the greatest impact since the 20th century was Ross Perot, and he got 21% of the popular vote, but not one electoral vote. He didn't come close. All third-party candidates do is kind of arbitrarily take votes away from possibly one or the other of the two major party candidates. The real election is between the two major party candidates who have a real chance of winning. And our responsibility is to be involved in that choice, because one or the other is going to win. And we need to choose between who's going to contribute to the greatest good or produce the least harm. What Ronald Reagan said about freedom is applicable as well to the sanctity of human life in America. Reagan said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it on to them to do the same." We have a lot of unfinished work to do. Let's get on with it. Thank you for coming today. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions for as long as we have.
First of all, Clarke, thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And all the work that you do.
Thank you.
So I've got 2 or 3 different questions. With respect to your first item up there, one of the concerns that I have and others have is that it seems that there are not any Republicans to speak of supporting President Trump. If they are, I'm missing it. So can you address that at all? Because, again, Joe mentioned, for instance, Senator Cornyn, we've got Senator Cruz, but it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of public support out there of our president by the Republican Party, the office holders.
Well, I see more of it. I see more, at least in office holders, talking about it in the media. I mean, I don't have exact figures here, and your PAC representatives here today would have a better handle on all that. But I do see it reflected in a number of different ways. I do see it reflected in Republican members of the House, Republican members of the Senate who are supporting the president's agenda and supporting victories for the president. So I think it's reflected in there. So it's issue by issue, but I do see Republican members of the Senate and the House and state legislators in various ways, coming on board. You may be also referring to polling. Polling is uncertain, but again, we've got 88 days to go. It reminds me of 2016, frankly, the state of the race. I mean, it wasn't determined until very late in the game. And as I talk with people around the country, I remind them that these races are often determined late. They're often determined by unanticipated events that occur late in the race. There are always October surprises. And, there are a lot of phenomenon and eventualities that could transpire between now and the election that could change things. The economy, the state of the pandemic, military consequences abroad, foreign policy events. All kinds of things can happen between now and Election Day that could change things. So that's one reason why all of us need to be working for the next 88 days to see this, to influence pro-life victories. I hope that answers your question, at least in part.
Yeah. One more. Okay. With respect to what's happened in New York, and again, not a lot of the details, but I think New York Planned Parenthood has dropped the name or tried to dissociate itself from Margaret Sanger, and vis-a-vis what's going on with race relations. Do you see that as being something that, for lack of a better word, could be exploited or at least made to greater public knowledge so that the black population in particular would see what a upside-down world it is?
Well, yes, I think that there's already been a lot of talk across the nation about Planned Parenthood of New York City dropping Margaret Sanger label. Obviously, pro-life people have been have been criticizing Margaret Sanger and her eugenicist background for decades, and calling upon, Planned Parenthood nationally to renounce Margaret Sanger and her legacy. And it's been fortunate that with our national dialogue about race relations over the last 4 months, the reiteration of need to protect civil rights and to protect people of all color, that finally Planned Parenthood of New York City has admitted her eugenicist background, her racist background. That's great, and I'm glad to see it. We applauded it when it happened, and I hope more Planned Parenthoods around the country will renounce her legacy and be done with it.
Do you have another question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Please. Go ahead.
So, Chris Oates, somebody who's watching online on Facebook Live, has a question for you.
Sure.
His question is, Chief Justice Roberts seems to be very sensitive to the public's view of the court and its validity, to the point that he joined a majority he disagreed with rather than overturn precedent. Do you think that the peaceful nature of the pro-life movement feeds his willingness to rule against us, i.e., is he more intimidated by the other side?
Well, I think many commentators have affirmed how much he is politically sensitive and politically attuned to the court's reputation and its legitimacy and its public image. They've commented upon that case by case. I don't think that non-peaceful means would be any kind of positive have any positive impact on the court or on any of the justices. I mean, I think the Chief Justice is influenced by a lot of things, not just politics, so we shouldn't overemphasize politics. But as I said in my remarks, the justices can only be, especially Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, can only be positively impacted by pro-life victories and showing democratic, elections endorsing pro-life policies and pro-life candidates. And that's one very effective way and should be one key focus of all of us. But showing public support for life in all the ways that we can is important. And so we have to show it through passing legislation, electoral victories, public opinion, and the state attorneys general going before the Supreme Court and making the case for life. All of those are ways that are positive ways that we can influence the court.
I have one more question from our online audience. We actually have people watching from all over the country, so it's phenomenal.
That's great.
Question. Inside the pro-life community, there is disagreement, sometimes vehement, between quote-unquote abolitionists and incrementalism. States that try and pass something less than the total abolition of abortion, such as heartbeat bills, always end up being enjoined by federal courts and end up paying abortion facilities millions of dollars, essentially funding them for a year or more. Any comments on this disagreement, quote unquote, or what would you say to the abolitionists?
Well, first of all, I think debate within a movement is inevitable and positive. It's always good for us to be talking about ideas and debating ideas and debating strategies and what's effective. And my experience over 35 years is people can float all kinds of ideas, but the effective ones rise to the top and the ineffective ones kind of sink to the bottom. And so that's an inevitable part of a movement. I mean, you see it, you can go back and look at the history of the civil rights movement in the country, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and you can see debates ongoing between various leaders at that time, and the effective strategies rose to the top, and the ineffective strategies kind of withered away. And so that's inevitable, and I think it's positive, and I think that debate is good and healthy, and we shouldn't shirk from it. But at the same time, I think we also have to be mindful of obstacles, and we can't ignore obstacles. And when we fail, it's because, in my experience, we either ignored obstacles, or didn't have an effective strategy to circumvent obstacles, or didn't have the resources and the application of prudence to overcome those obstacles. So today, the courts are still an obstacle. The makeup of some legislatures are still an obstacle. There are gubernatorial obstacles. There are billionaires like Warren Buffett and George Soros and numerous billion-dollar foundations who are fighting against us 24/7 to defeat us and defeat pro-life in America. And if we don't confront those obstacles and effectively circumvent those obstacles, we won't prevail. And one of the obstacles today are the courts and injunctions. And we need to focus on the Supreme Court and Roe versus Wade, because that is the essential problem. When the court overturns Roe and returns the issue to the states, the federal courts will be out of the way. And that will change the dynamic. And so we need to keep in a sense, we need to keep our eye on the ball. Yes.
Thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate it.
It's good to be with you.
You mentioned 87 days, 88 days until election. It seems like it's further away than that. It's already August.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, doing something between now and then. And Joe, thanks for the super PAC. That's awesome. That's one thing. Can you recommend, suggest any practical things to do between now and then to help pro-life candidates get elected? And
Well, I think you've already mentioned them. One thing perhaps you haven't mentioned is simply that, as individuals, we're kind of weak, but we need to, be allied with organizations that are making a difference. So being allied with PACs, working with them. As you mentioned a number of other things, though, making individual contributions to candidates, devoting our time with local races or statewide races. It's time and resources, but also multiplying our impact by being allied with pro-life political organizations that are working for the same goals that we want. That's key. So all of those together. We can also write op-eds, publish, op-eds, commentaries, trying to influence our family and friends, just putting information in their hands about the records of various candidates, helping them to be informed so they are informed voters and so they can go to the polls informed about where candidates stand. All of these working together are important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forsythe. My question is, of the 60 cases in the pipeline, do you think any of them have the potential to overturn like Roe or Casey? And if so, do you think now is a good time given the empty majority in the court, or do you think that would just be more bad precedent?
Well, I talked about this in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last July 2019, called The Smart Way to Overturn Roe versus Wade, and I addressed some of those, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. There's some myth out there, kind of an urban legend, that we have to have the perfect case and the perfect record and the perfect prohibition and a complete prohibition to create the perfect test case. And all that is basically wrong. The court can re-examine Roe versus Wade or Planned Parenthood versus Casey in any case involving abortion and a state limit that arguably conflicts with Roe versus Wade. It can be an informed consent case, ultrasound case, parental notice case, abortion funding case. Any of these cases, any of the 60, could be the vehicle for the court to overturn Roe and Doe. So it's not about finding the next perfect case. All these cases, and that's good for us. We don't have to find the perfect case. Any of these cases could be the vehicle. But the second point is that you need 5 justices, and as I was saying, we really need 6 or 7 to be willing to do so. So again, it comes back to the elections and working in 2021 and beyond to change the membership of the court. And right now, it's elections. There are a lot of good things we can do, but right now, the elections and the election for the presidency, the president nominates, the U.S. Senate confirms or doesn't, as we saw with the Garland case in early 2016. The Senate and the Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, basically said, we're not going to have any hearings or approve any new justice before the 2016 election, and they didn't. So the presidency nominates, the Senate confirms or doesn't confirm. Those elections are key. And really, frankly, much else kind of pales, at least in this context and at this time. We need to, as I said before, kind of keep our eye on the ball about elections. And if we have, if we change the court and add to the membership, it won't be hard for us to find a case that the court will take up. The other thing that I mentioned in that article is that you can't force the court to take any case. Legislators can't force the court to take their ideal law. The court has a virtually complete discretion as to which, if any, cases it ever takes. So we have to take that into consideration as well, and that also reveals, the need for a willingness of the justices to take up the issue. So again, it comes back to the membership of the court and elections. I hope that answers your question.
You're rightly focusing on the litigation and legislation aspects of overturning Roe. There are some other factors in the pro-life movement itself. For example, the pregnancy health centers.
Amen.
And there's scientific advances, sonograms. How do you see some of those other factors contributing to overturning Roe?
Well, I think all of those can influence public opinion. They can influence pro-life elections. They can also influence the information and the data that's put into cases, entered into the evidence in cases, and that makes its way to the Supreme Court. For example, Justice Thomas, over the past 2 years, I think since December of 2017, has written a number of separate opinions on various aspects. He wrote one opinion on the eugenic background of abortion in the United States. He wrote another opinion on discriminatory abortion. He wrote another opinion on dismemberment abortion and how it rips apart an unborn baby. So these facts and data that are in the record and that can be brought to the court can influence the justices. I think another thing, in addition to what you mentioned, is frankly the growing international data on the long-term risks of abortion to women that is reflected, if you haven't read it or picked up one, in the informed consent packet on the back table and the other packet back there. Those have information about the risks, long-term risk of preterm birth after abortion, long-term risk of breast cancer after abortion, the long-term risk of mental health problems after abortion. There's been growing international data in dozens of countries involving millions of women in 20 or 30 different countries about these findings of an increased risk of preterm birth after abortion and so forth. All of these can be brought into the legislation in the states, which then leads to the cases, which then gets up to the Supreme Court. But it also can be influential in op-eds, in your paper. They can, there are a number of different media ways, public education ways, legislation ways, court case ways that we can bring this data to the attention of the public and to the court. And we need to be doing all of it. I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much.